show, which was kind of fan fiction in and of itself. I was trying to, like everybody else, I was trying to think of something to do, pick a fandom, and I was like, wouldn't it be great to pick something offbeat? And so I was like, I got it, I'm gonna write Flannery O'Connor fan fiction, because Flan fiction is so awesome, such a great portmanteau. And I sat down, I was like, the grandmother didn't want to go to Florida, and so they stayed home and everybody lived, and that was it. And so I was like, no, I have to think bigger, a bigger world. So I wrote this. It's called The Core of Rediscovery. After the bombs went off, and about the time the world cracked and splintered and all but folded in on itself, the men and women responsible for the entire clusterfuck got into their ships and retreated to separate corners of the solar system to cool off. If the stories are to be believed, my great-great-grandmother held her middle finger up in high salute as she lay dying of radiation sickness in some neighbor's cellar. Good riddance, she allegedly said. We never wanted them here in the first place. Within 4 weeks, she was dead, along with nearly everyone she ever knew, save for an eldest daughter who fled the res 6 months earlier. The way my mother tells the story, the girl was attending some fancy college in Iowa or Nebraska or Michigan. My aunt swears she ran off with some white boy soldier, that she got knocked up and they eloped. He went off to war and she got to stay on the base, which was lucky for her when everything went to shit. When the dust settled, she made her way back to Idaho. They say the apocalypse was strong enough to blow the tops off the Bitterroot Mountains 500 miles north, but it wasn't enough to get our family out of the middle of fucking nowhere. She had a daughter, and that daughter had a daughter, and you can keep connecting the chain of daughters right down to me. None of us were born with 3 heads or anything, which is good news, because who needs another mouth to feed out here? That's a joke, considering my current situation. By the time the Corps rolled into Fort Hall, we'd all but gone back to tribal life. We hunted, we fished, we took what we could from the irradiated soil. Lieutenant Clark says we were lucky because detonation occurred in the mountains, surface contamination in the valley was minimal. A little black rain, a little alpha, beta, gamma. The half-lives of particles were fleeting. Around the same time my great-great-grandmother was cursing the lieutenant's ancestors, tiny shoots of grass were already pushing their way up through the shadowy remains of the prairie. I was the first to see them. I'd been down at the river washing my clothes. For as long as I can remember, stories have been blowing into town, along with every drifter and band of doomsday prophets, cohorts in Europe, China, even as close as Mexico. I always assumed these stories were true, but figured no one would care much about BFE Idaho. Turns out the cities weren't worth saving, or at least they wouldn't be for another couple hundred years. But Sawtooth, Yellowstone, all that land. So here they were, the recon unit, making their way west on 86. Most of them were on foot, but bringing up the rear was an enormous black vehicle that didn't look like anything I'd ever seen riding in the yards around town. They stayed at Fort Hall for 3 weeks, taking samples of the water, bagging dirt for the lab, and trading whatever they could for supplies, mostly food. I poked around, made myself a nuisance, in a way that I hoped was endearing. Everyone knew what I was after. Absolutely not, said Captain Lewis. No civilians. I'm not ashamed to say I begged. The captain sighed and leveled his gaze on my belly. You trying to find the boy that did that to you, is that it? I could all but feel my ears pull back at that, like a cat that suddenly turns on you. Mister, I said, the boy who did this to me played his part, same as boys have been playing their part since your people left us here to rot in your mess. I put a hand to my belly. As far as I'm concerned, she's mine alone. Our family didn't have much in the way of heirlooms, but we had an old atlas, precious as any forgotten cache of gasoline or buckshot that had been passed down from my great-great-grand. No one in the family ever made it out past 86, but the atlas reminded us of what we could never hope to reach on our own, that beyond Twin Falls, 86 turned into 84 and curved up alongside the Snake River all the way to the sea. It was Lieutenant Clark who convinced Captain Lewis. Bjork doesn't like me asking too many questions about the lieutenant's personal life, but I've seen the way Captain Lewis looks at him. I've seen the captain reach right over and steal a couple of wild blueberries from the lieutenant's cupped hand when he thought no one was watching. I've seen Lieutenant Clark's cheeks flush when Captain Lewis says, "This is the second best thing about today." Clark figured I'd be useful as a sort of ambassador. Not everyone is as welcoming as we were, even though the Corps is mostly made up of scientists and surveyors. They wear fatigues, and they carry sidearms, and that makes a lot of folks uneasy. You know what makes them less uneasy? A polite, pregnant teenager. I hold special sway in communities where matriarchs run the show. Once a settlement is found to be reasonably friendly, Captain Lewis lets me do the talking. I know these people, despite the fact that I've never met them before. We all speak English, but I speak the language. The day I left, my mother didn't even cry. She just slipped the atlas into my pack and told me to be good, like I was some little kid going down the street to the neighbors. I hugged her hard. We'll be back, I said. Between us, the baby kicked her once or twice for good measure. I offered to walk with the cohort, but Lewis insisted I ride in the mobile lab with the YRK unit. That's what he calls Yerk, who's in charge of driving. Technically, Yerk isn't military either. He's been in Lieutenant Clark's family for years, serving as a sort of companion to Clark's father and now to him. Companion, that's the word the lieutenant used. It's a nice word, too nice to actually describe what Yerk is, which is someone without a choice. Before the Corps, I'd never seen an android, and when we first set out, I asked him if they were all as quiet as he is. Does the fact that I don't say much bother you? It was a non-answer, which was kind of an answer all the same. I told him it was no big deal, living out here your whole life, you get used to the silence. And that was weeks ago. According to my atlas, we're nearly out of Idaho, meaning I've already been further from home than anyone in my family in nearly 100 years. It's slow going, made slower by the fact that one of the privates shot Captain Lewis. We were camped up on a ridge near Lake Lowell, and a few of the men organized a hunting party. The captain's a lousy shot, everyone knows it, but he always tags along in case they run into some plant or animal that he hasn't collected yet. I don't know how that's even possible. The shelves of the mobile lab are crammed with specimen boxes and jars full of dead things in black, brown liquid. Clark got separated from the party, and one of the guys, Cruzette, mistook him for a bear or something, shot him right in the ass. Me and Yerk had a good laugh about that one. The captain's fine. He just needs a few days to recover, and then we're back at it, making our way to the ocean, slow and steady, following the curve of 84 like honey oozing down the back of a spoon. Sometimes I wonder what my great-great-grandmother would make of me traipsing across the old Shoshone territory with the Corps. If it had been her on the side of the road that day, she probably would have walked right up to them and told them to fuck off. Go back to your space colonies. You're not wanted here. Me? I couldn't live with myself if I didn't take this chance. The chance to see the Pacific, to dip my daughter's feet in it. Lieutenant Clark is certain that it's a boy. He teases that all the heartburn I've been having means he's going to come out of me with a pompadour. But I know better. I know that the chain of daughters will remain unbroken. I'll have a daughter, and maybe by the time she has a daughter, the world will be different, and she'll be able to chart her own path. I'll tell her all of the stories about her great-great-great-grandmother and the girl on the army base, and how my own mother taught me to read a map long before we ever made our way out to the